Hi all, welcome to the Moments in Refugee History and the Development of the Modern Refugee Regime seminar series. My name is Dr. Nicholas Maple and I'm a lecturer in Refugee Studies at the Refugee Law Initiative, University of London, and I'll be chairing this event. So the Moments in Refugee History and Development of the Modern Refugee Regime series sees the refugee law collaborate with refugee histories to convene a cross-disciplinary series of events which brings together scholars of history and contemporary refugee law and policy to engage in key issues relating to the refugee protection regime. This series probes important and often less recognized moments in the refugee history to further our understandings of developments in these fields. It's been a really fantastic series of events, and this being the fourth of the series, with one final event taking place in March. And I'll share more about this, the fifth one, at the end of the seminar. For today's event, I'm delighted to introduce our two experts, Dr. Anne Nguyen Austin and Riona Moodley, for this seminar on maritime refugee journeys, solidarity, regional processing, and saving lives at sea. Dr. Anne Nguyen Austin will be launching us into this discussion with a talk on dangerous maritime journeys, dangerous maritime journeys shape refugees' communities' experiences and sense of belonging. Dr. Austin is a refugee and migration historian. She teaches about refugee social enterprises, and her community-based research and engagement includes the use of game design, storytelling, and mentoring for measuring impact empowerment of refugees and migrants in Australia. She is the founding editor of the Digital Diaspora book series with Routledge and an honorary research associate with Museums Victoria. She is currently with the Centre for Refugees, Migration and Humanitarian Studies at the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences of the Australian Catholic University. Following this, Dr. Riona Moodley will be reflecting on how regional actors respond to mass maritime movements. How regional actors responded to the mass maritime movements of Indo-Chinese refugees. Dr. Moodley is a lecturer at the Faculty of Law and Justice and researcher at the Institute for Climate Risk and Response at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. She completed her PhD in International Refugee and EU Asylum Law in 2024 at the Caldwell Centre for International Refugee Law, where she's also a research affiliate. Riona is also an Australian lawyer specialising in commercial litigation and refugee and human rights law. In terms of the format then for this seminar, each presenter will speak for approximately 15 minutes. After the presentations, we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions and discussions. So if you'd like to ask a question as you're listening to the presentation or after both have finished, please do use the Q&A box functionality in Zoom. Okay, that's enough from me. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Dr. Austin to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Sarah and Riona, and this chance to share my work with you all. I am going to open with our welcome to country and acknowledgement of the Indigenous people of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I work and live, and as a refugee to live in gratitude for their custodianship and care of the land. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about maritime journeys, and it starts with this picture to the left. This is a reunion of boat people, Vietnamese boat people that are part of my boat as a child, which is called the 101 boat. And this is the doctor that was a Vietnamese doctor. He had studied in France and happened to be doing his kind of residency period at the time. And he got to come onto the boat with Medicine du Monde to go and rescue what were his compadres from Vietnam. You know, he was a young man. He left at 17. He never thought he would see his country again. And then in the 80s, he ends up rescuing them at sea. And this is the boat, La Goyle. And each year they have a mass in Paris. to commemorate the survivors of the boat. So this picture was given to me when I was doing my PhD. My father told me about it, and I was in a conference in London, actually, on histories of childhood. And because my PhD was about histories of childhood and forced migration. And I just thought that it might be worth it to share the picture with the colleagues in University of Melbourne. And there was one that was connected to Vietnamese scholars in Paris, and they recognized the doctor. So I went and met up with him, and that's how I kind of recovered some of the interesting historical film and footage about the maritime journey of my own boat as a child, and which is based on the work that I'll share with you today. So when I met the doctor, and this is him in the film footage, and he's lifting this 81-year-old man from our village onto the boat, because I learned that, you know, my parents had the boat built in order for us to escape, because children would endanger passages, you know, cry and things. So my father had tried to leave several times, but could not make it in the passage until we built our own boat. So what happens is I kind of go to the anniversary meeting in Paris several years into the PhD. And it happened to be the year my parents would come to the Mass. And then, you know, it was a very unique year, like all the people who helped to build the boat and were all in one space together. And so I just happened to interview them. And I started to collect things like, you know, I had a friend there who was very curious and was like, you know, how big is this boat? You know, what's happened? Like, you know, and how, you know, how did it survive at sea? And so we collected that data. It was just my chance to collect family oral history. I didn't really think anything of it until I came back to Melbourne. And my colleagues here, Joy DeMusi and Mary Tomzik, who are at the Institute with me, and they had connected with Alessandro and Filippo. And Alessandro and Filippo were water engineers, which means that they could find the historical data of the conditions of the sea in which our boat existed based on the oral histories that I had. So I had the people who were building the boat and who knew about the journey, and they put that into oral history. They had the sea conditions, and they could put the science behind you know, the modeling of whether we were going to capsize and how we understood our journey. Now, this article is kind of multiple disciplines, and the paradox of it is that, you know, they celebrate this at a Catholic Mass, so they believe that it was a miracle of God, like a miracle in the natural sense, and, you know, God being in control of the ocean. But the science also showed that the storms that we survived was like a, you know, of a magnitude that was once every 100 years. So it was just interesting to parallel the oral histories and the science and thinking about the history of oceanic humanitarianism, which is a phrase from Peter Gattrell. So what we sort of see is this kind of rescue point, and it had to do with a great many things, including the way the ocean acted. So this is a little bit of an argument of more than human, that, you know, the ocean in its particular storms and conditions assisted us to the point of rescue, which is the red star. Now, Filippo and Alessandro would go through all these things, and you can geek out on the science of it in the article as much as you'd like about. But I think what I understood from what I can do in the oral history is the point of departure, Vungtao, and then the rescue point. And there was a kind of storm to the right. That's the yellow part right there. And so it's because our boat engine dies, because it was only built for 45 people, but 101 people are on it. The boat dies, it starts to drift away from the storm. The storm is pushing it, and then that pushes us to the rescue point where Lagoil, that big ship, rescues us. So there's kind of risk modeling and all the science of that. But in this kind of idea about oceanic humanitarianism, these boat journeys, 1982 is very late. The last refugee camp closes in 1989. So we're picked up by Lagoil. We're sent to Palawan in the Philippines. And I was able to find there was a Norwegian anthropologist that actually took notes and visited the camp where my little brother is born in the 1982 period, and he makes a count of the people. And so there's lots of kind of data that's found particular to also mentioning the boat and its arrival, as in Lagoil's arrival to dump people or at the refugee camp. And my parents, kind of run onto the beach and they see their fellow villagers, and that so there was this kind of a very personal historical event for us. And the footage is really useful because it did promote more humanitarian rescues. And in this period in Germany, we have Cap Enemer, which was a German boat that was one of the first to become a rescue boat for refugees during this period as well. And this idea that the ocean becomes this social, political, environmental space, and it inspired people who saw on film at the time people drowning. And Nurduk, who is the founder of Cap Enemer, he went on television and he used these bank codes that were memorized. He was a journalist. He wanted to mortgage his house to go and rescue people at sea and get a boat. And his friend said, "Why don't you get on television and try to raise some money?" And so he gave him like 3 minutes. He mentioned some bank codes. He showed footage of the news. And then he raised the first boats that came from Germany to go and rescue people. This particular boat is the first Australian boat of Vietnamese refugees that lands in Darwin. It's called the Trudeau. And I work with the Maritime Museum on trying to preserve this boat physically to be part of the maritime history of Australia as well. So the other aspect is that, talking about communities and belonging, I was looking at refugees on Facebook, and you could see the type of communities that were built. At the bottom here, right corner, or my right corner, Cap Enemer, that's boat people that were rescued by that particular boat. So children like myself who grew up, and also their parents, all joined these Facebook communities looking for each other and sharing historical information and asking about their lives now. And the other way that they congregate is around the refugee camp that they were from. So they rescue boats or refugee camps, and that's how they find each other. And there's a lot going on these pages, and I write about it as a historian in terms of like a refugee curated history and this concept of becoming a digital diaspora. And there are very particular things that you can learn from Facebook, documents that are not in museums, and people's life stories as they're going through now and reflecting upon their identity and their experiences. So that's the most of my PhD and recent book. This idea of this active site of memory is still ongoing, and people kind of still connect with each other, find each other, and reunion with each other. This is, for instance, a young man who is an unaccompanied minor. He's reunioning with someone in Vietnam. Mr. Tan was a caretaker. Mr. Tan would have been a Vietnamese that was in the refugee camp, but he volunteered to take care of the unaccompanied minors because unaccompanied minors were in a separate house and they didn't have any family. So some people volunteered to take care of them. And so he's reunioning with one of the volunteers, which was a Vietnamese refugee in the camp. And so these are the types of real-time reunions, and they happen everywhere, like LA. There was one in Melbourne, and I went to that as well during my PhD. And the person who administers these Facebook groups is actually a Melburnian as well. Now, just to kind of sum up the kind of how lived experiences of boat journeys connect people and are an ongoing part of their identity now and community building now. There was this little animation that some students made about my PhD that I wanted to share with you.
Hi Naomi,
Hello Nam,
cũng lâu rồi đám mình chưa gặp, bạn có đi họp mặt ở Melbourne không?
tôi chuẩn bị đặt bay đấy. Tôi vừa thấy tấm ảnh tụi mình chụp chung trong nhóm của Facebook.
Ủa tấm ảnh nào vậy bà?
Tấm ảnh tụi mình chụp hồi ở trại tập trung Paula Gaviria đó.
Cái đám kia hồi đó toàn làm ba cái chuyện linh tinh thôi.
Làm gì cơ?
Thì hồi đó mới vô trại tập trung, chứ nghĩ tụi mình là điệp viên nằm vùng đó.
Thời đấy cỏ mọc tùm nên mỗi lần trong đi trốn trong giống như Lý Tiểu Long, còn ông giống như James Bond.
Không, tôi là Bruce Lee, bà là James Bond.
Cái thời xưa đó lâu rồi ha, tôi vẫn còn nhớ mọi người lúc ấy. Thảo có đi không vậy?
Chắc có đó, Ngọc chắc chắn sẽ đến, nó bay từ tận bên Pháp qua đó.
Ta không thể tin được tụi mình có thể gặp nhau sau ngần ấy năm nhỉ?
Không có gì làm phai mờ quãng thời gian, chúng ta chia sẻ cùng nhau. Giờ ngồi ôn lại kỷ niệm này, cứ ngỡ như đoàn tụ gia đình vậy. Giờ mạng xã hội mà tình cảm tụi mình khăng khít nhau hơn nhỉ?
Thật tuyệt vời nhỉ?
Quá là tuyệt vời.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a very rich and powerful talk. Thank you. Lots of themes around belonging, but also you touched on a lot of stuff around rescue at sea, which I think we can hopefully explore a little bit later on. But for now, I will, before we get into the discussion, I'll pass over to Dr. Moodley for the second presentation. Over to you, Anne. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick, Sarah, and the RLI for hosting today's event. And thank you, Anne, for such a rich account of your personal journey and the journeys of so many others like you. Building on from Anne, my presentation is going to zoom out a fair bit to a much more political, legal overview of what was occurring at the time. of the mass displacement of Vietnamese refugees and how the regional actors as well as the international community responded. So in particular, I'm going to be looking at the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese Refugees, or also known as the CPA, which was a non-binding international framework that was used to respond to both the crisis, the refugee crisis, as well as the maritime movement of people associated with it that occurred at the end of the Vietnam War. Now, while the CPA is not the only example of a comprehensive regional approach, it is important to recognize that the CPA remains one of the most significant examples of international cooperation on refugee protection, both in terms of the broad involvement of stakeholders, but also the protection outcomes it managed to achieve for over 3 million people. In noting this, I do want to be quite clear. In no way do I wish to downplay or overlook the many shortcomings and flaws of that process to implement the CPA. But on the whole, however, I do think the Indo-Chinese CPA offers a really valuable case study on how the international community can respond more effectively, equitably, and humanely to refugee and irregular maritime movements. So in terms of my goal today, it's really to highlight, to first provide background to what occurred and how the agreement was reached, what the agreement entailed, and then to highlight some of the key historical lessons from the CPA, and then consider, how those lessons might inform future approaches to, for example, regional processing during mass or protracted refugee situations. So let me just provide a little bit of context. The CPA had its initial beginnings at the end of the Vietnam War, so this is around 1975, as hundreds of thousands of people began fleeing Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos to neighboring countries in the region. So that included Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, to name a few. The scale of the movement, in particular the number of maritime arrivals at a certain point proved too overwhelming for a number of the regional states, prompting many of them to start to push back asylum seekers and maritime boats by force. Of course, this resulted in a number of asylum seekers dying at sea. The crisis prompted the UN Secretary General to convene 2 international conferences to respond to the situation, the first in 1979 and then a second 10 years later in 1989. Both the conferences engaged a very broad spectrum of stakeholders from both within and outside the region. So this included 65 governments, this was resettlement countries, from outside the region, countries of first asylum within the region, and importantly, regions of origin. So this also included Vietnam at certain points. Together with, of course, international organizations, UNHCR was heavily involved in the process of negotiating the CPA, as well as other grassroots NGOs. Although no binding legal commitments were made in 1979, the first meeting did lead to general principles of asylum and non-refoulement being affirmed, and in exchange for that being guaranteed by countries within the region, countries abroad guaranteed that they would provide those seeking asylum refuge through resettlement. However, when the numbers of asylum seekers began increasing again in 1986, a second conference was convened to renegotiate the terms of the earlier agreement, and this ultimately led to the development of the CPA framework. So importantly, while one of the CPA's principal objectives was to restore the right to seek asylum across Southeast Asia in circumstances where many countries of first asylum were now refusing again to provide temporary protection, the overriding purpose of the CPA in 1989 was to actually bring an end to the ongoing movement of asylum seekers from Vietnam. And so seen in this light, what the arrangement sought to do was to essentially strike a balance between political pragmatism, as well as human rights law principles. It was decided at that 1989 conference that the presumption of refugee status for Indo-Chinese refugees would cease, and that a new suite of measures would need to be taken comprehensively to resolve the crisis. And to also, and this is, we can discuss this further in the chat, but one of the aims was to also disincentivize the arrival of people using boats. So there were a number of novel innovations with the CPA. The first was that it developed region-wide processing to enable refugee status determination to be undertaken en masse across the region. So now those found to be refugees would be resettled abroad, and those found not to be refugees would be returned to their country of origin. In exchange, countries of first asylum agreed that they would stop pushing back boats. They would provide temporary asylum to those who arrived on their territories pending resettlement and repatriation. And they'd also assume primary responsibility for undertaking refugee status determination, or RSD, under the supervision of UNHCR and in accordance with the Refugee Convention. Now, that was quite an interesting development because many of the countries in Southeast Asia were not signatories to the convention, and I think only one since the CPA. I think the Philippines is the only other Southeast Asian country that has since ratified the convention. But we can unpack that a bit later too. But due to the geopolitical context and post-war context that existed at the time, countries of first asylum did not agree to integrate any of the new arrivals into their own populations, be they refugees or not. So as a result, repatriation or a return option to Vietnam for those not found to be refugees actually proved quite critical to win over their support as part of this arrangement. So this, of course, then made Vietnam an essential partner to the CPA. Interestingly, Vietnam at the time was wanting to re-engage both politically and economically with the international community. So as part of that re-engagement, it agreed to voluntarily accept those who had voluntarily returned on the basis that they would not suffer persecution. As part of that process, they also agreed to give full access to returnees. Full access to returnees was given to UNHCR to monitor that obligation. Vietnam also agreed to work with UNHCR and the international community to implement what was referred to as the Orderly Departure Program. And that was a very innovative program because what it sought to do for the first time was allow individuals who are seeking asylum abroad to do so from within their country. So it was a mechanism used to also provide an alternative to irregular maritime travel. So through each of these interlocking commitments, so resettlement, temporary protection, repatriation, and the Orderly Departure Program, you had the CPA working in multiple ways to try to resolve the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis in a somewhat holistic sense to address all of these stakeholder concerns, including, of course, the need for people to seek durable solutions and protection. Implementation, though, was not without its flaws. During its initial stages, refugee status determination had a number of procedural issues. Recognition rates were inconsistent across the region, prompting concerns that people might be returned to persecution. Many asylum seekers were also held in closed detention with limited access to education and work rights. The repatriation component, though critical to the CPA's implementation, was also criticized because it countenanced the possibility of forced return. A broader criticism that has been leveled at the CPA, particularly by scholars from the global north, is that many believe that the framework created a negative legacy of diminished responsibility and standards of protection in Southeast Asia. whereby it suggested that that states in Southeast Asia now provide temporary protection on the basis that resettlement should occur elsewhere. More recent scholarship, however, has contested these perceptions, noting that such criticism does not sufficiently recognize the role that the global north played in causing displacement at the time, including the impact of neo-colonial imperialism. So, for example, in her post-World War II analysis of refugee protection in Southeast Asia, my colleague at the Caldor Center, Natasha Ángel-Cabo, notes that for such criticism also fails to sufficiently acknowledge the rich history of refugee protection that did not start or end with Global North involvement in the CPA. Overall, despite its many failings, the overall quality of procedural fairness and the standard of regional consistency in refugee determination improved over time, and was also relatively high, even according to those who were very critical of it. This was largely attributed to the central supervisory role that UNHCR played in monitoring each and managing each of these different components of the agreement. Over the quarter century that the displacement of Indo-Chinese refugees endured, over 3 million people were displaced across the region. However, as a consequence of the CPA and the sustained international effort to resolve the crisis, approximately 2.5 million people were resettled elsewhere and 500,000 people were repatriated. So this brings me to what can we learn today from the CPA? And arguably there are many lessons, but I'd like to highlight what I consider to be, I think, 3 of the most important. I mean, what the CPA demonstrated was that it's only through broad political engagement and the equitable sharing of responsibilities based on capacity that a truly comprehensive regional refugee response can be implemented to its conclusion. Regional processing, if undertaken in the same vein as the CPA, it does have the potential to coordinate global efforts to address regional refugee situations, but this again requires multi-stakeholder collaboration and partnerships from countries within and outside the region. It requires the involvement of international organizations that can supervise the implementation of the agreement, like it did with UNHCR's role. And it also requires the involvement of refugees and migrants with lived experience themselves. Secondly, but perhaps most importantly, what the CPA demonstrated is that for any multilateral refugee response to be sustained, it must be premised on clear commitments by all stakeholders to respect international and human rights law principles. Now, on an overview of the CPA itself, it's quite clear that this was largely a political agreement in many respects. But when you look at the negotiations that were being had between all of these multiple stakeholder states, you can see that they were operating within a framework of international protection, which was really important to achieving the outcomes that were ultimately achieved for such a large number of people. The final takeaway from the CPA is that durable solutions, and when I refer to durable solutions, I'm referring to what are the primary durable solutions that UNHCR refers to, so resettlement, repatriation, and local integration. All 3 are needed for those who are traveling irregularly, be they refugees or not. I think one of the most critical issues causing irregular maritime flight is the absence of safe, orderly, and regular pathways for international protection and migration. In this regard, the CPA was one of the first international attempts to address this by providing refugees and migrants with durable solutions in countries of asylum, but it also importantly provided alternatives to irregular travel through the Orderly Departure Program. Of course, the CPA noticeably excluded local integration for most of the people seeking asylum in the region of origin. To be truly comprehensive, arguably future efforts should accommodate all three traditional solutions where it's safe to do so. But this could also be complemented by other migration pathways, including something akin to an orderly departure program, as well as education and labor mobility programs. I might stop there, but what I'm hoping to convey through my talk today is that despite its historic and context-specific nature, there are a number of parallels that can still be drawn between the CPA experience and contemporary efforts to manage irregular migration and respond to refugee protection in a way that is both pragmatic but principled when we're looking at refugee rights. I might end there and we can open up a little bit more to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was excellent and a really nice complementary discussion with Anne's. And thank you both again for your excellent presentation.